All right, guys, welcome back. We're ready to move ahead with a little bit more photography and realism today. We had just finished up talking about the rise of photography, some very early daguerreotypes and processes that made photography possible. Now we're moving more toward the middle of the century, where we're talking about when it really comes into its fore. The image that I have in mind is the one of Nadar elevating photography to the level or status of high art. And it is a lithograph by Charles Daumier. We're really kind of talking about both artists here with this artwork, and I think that's why it's in the image set. We'll talk about lithograph as a new form of printmaking, one that is more suitable to the popular rise of the newspaper. A little cheaper, but also much more durable and long lasting for the higher number of images you would need to print over and over again. But I wanted to bag things up before looking at that artwork and talk about this important photographer. He's pretty much known as a portraitist. So that's really where photography begins to come to the fore. People are able, in a very short take or very short sitting, to have their image affixed and ready to distribute fairly easily, where before it took a series of sittings in a portrait studio with a painter agonizing over lots and lots and lots of details. I'd mentioned the fact that Ong is going to stop painting. Ong's real bread and butter at this point is portraits. And he's surprised that people are able to access the same level and quality in a painting as quickly as they are in a photograph. But this is a portrait of the poet Baudelaire. He was a real champion of realism in the middle of the century, saying that there needed to be an art parallel to the heroism required to live the modern life. And so here is the artist. Here is the writer about the art movement realism being photographed by a very contemporary device. It has basically the same kind of drama that you would get inside a staged painted portrait. So you can see why these might have had a wide based appeal. Plus, they were a lot cheaper. There was even a tradition in Paris by the time of the World's Exposition for your picture to be on the front of a calling card, where you would leave your information kind of like a business card and use that to communicate, almost as if you were creating a new social media out of that simple photograph. So people could keep track of people they'd met and who they wanted to contact again. So it was a form of networking that was made possible by the photograph. Nadar is actually his real name, Gaspar Felix Ternachon. He goes by this little acronym that he's just made up as a simple way for people to be able to identify him. So it's his acronym that shows up in the title of our work, Nadar. Here we have the writer George Sand, who was a close personal friend. By the mid 19th century, Nadar is really the go-to guy if you're going to have an artistic portrait done the right way. Meaning, if you're going to have one that's done in an academic sense, one that can kind of stand on its own merit and be as equivalent to a finished painted portrait. But you can see Nadar will play with many of the same topics and characters and notariable types that you would have seen painted in the previous century as part of Rococo. Clowns and people in costumes in parks were something that had become part of the academic tradition. The fact that Nadar is using Poirot, a very famous comic actor, as the person who's taking photography, he's combining his two passions together, comic theater and the art of photography. Some of you will be familiar with this name, Sandra Bernhard. She's a famous actress in the late 19th century in Paris, English actress who was able to play both male and female parts, and ends up doing things like Hamlet and a variety of other plays. with great acclaim. Many of the posters that were generated for her productions are some of our best kept examples of Art Nouveau toward the end of the late century. But you can kind of take a look at this piece and see that we're trying still to aim for the classical academic portrait. We have this column looking like plinth the actress is leaning on, and she is covered in a cape or a toga that looks like the curtain of a stage, right? It has the same kind of dramatic flair and sensibility that you would see if we were looking at a painted portrait. So I think this is really a part of the photographer's attempt to elevate that to a high art form. Here is the self-portrait of Nadar. Basically gives you an idea of his image and what he was known for, being meticulous and focused on detail. Here is a later image on the left by himself, on the right with his wife in studio and a basket attached to one of his famous balloons. Apparently, he was quite the aeronaut and used that vantage point to take pictures of the landscape and the cityscape in and around the city of Paris. His balloon was called the Giant, Le Géant, and basically he was well known as the first person to take those kinds of photos. They become kind of important for Impressionism, as you'll see next class. The vantage point of being up above the city, looking down on top of a busy city street would be a common focus for people who are trying to capture the essence of what it was like to be in a modern city, and this provided that vantage point. But so I'm guessing that Daumier was not far off the mark in lampooning Nadar this way. Of course, Nadar is working with a wet plate process, which is very challenging to deal with, where you're fixing the image in between two glass plates. And the image has to be stopped using chemicals. Nadar is shown balancing in the balloon here almost to his detriment, falling out of the darn thing. And down below him, we see the city of Paris with photography shops every single corner of every street. All the way up to the brand new, newly built Sacré-Cœur on top of Montmartre there. So have an icon of the art world floating above an iconic city. What you're going to see in Daumier's art is stuff that looks a lot like cartoon. Because these were quick, fast sketches on stones that would then be printed thousands of times in newspapers on a daily basis. Nadar is lampooned by Daumier in a way that he will lampoon others, but I wanted to just take a short minute to show you. I have included some videos on the website for you about the process of how you would ink a stone and then print from it. So some of them are longer than others. You might just take a quick look at one of them to see what the lithograph process is all about. Now, that process adds to our knowledge of woodcut, engraving, etching, and aquatint. And now we have the process of lithography. And in one of the videos, I think this gentleman right here mentioned the fact that this was one of the most sensitive processes to capture every move that the artist makes on top of that stone, rather than losing some of the dexterity to the carving process or to the acid bath. Every little manipulation of a stylus is captured on that stone, which is then inked and then printed. So it takes in all of the line art that the artist puts into it and repeats it in a way that can be recalled. Now, I wanted to show you one more print that I'm pretty fond of by Daumier. Daumier was working in the midst of the 19th century in a very difficult time period for French history. This is the same era we were talking about with Delacroix. 1848, there's a huge uprising that overthrows the installed king. You have a period after that of reaction. You have a new Louis Philippe installed, and he becomes the target of Daumier's press. And here we have presumably a printmaker who has been visited by a member of the French Assembly who's wearing a little tricolor badge on his hat and has come to shut the press down. But in guards to that. The printmaker's like, you're not going to mess with this. A free press is what makes our country work. So this is kind of telling, considering where we are right now with all the fake news and contemporary events. We have to have accurate information in order to having a functioning republic, and that's what Daumier is trying to emphasize here. Here, he tries to shine a light on the horrors of what the government's doing in the middle of the night, unbeknownst to many of the people who live and work in the city of Paris. There was a worker uprising that killed a few of the French guards on patrol that day. So in the middle of the night, the French brigade comes through this street, Rue Transnonain, and basically kills or assassinates people in the building where the supposed rioters who incited the riot were located. We see grandpa, we see dad, we see child, we see mom. This is indiscriminate of anybody's race or position in the household. And it does look literally like they've been ripped from their beds. They're still wearing their nightshirts. This is very similar to the nightshirt that was worn at the base of the triangle of victims in Liberty Leading the People by Delacroix that you saw. So Daumier is quite outspoken. He doesn't flinch, basically puts everything that he knows will be acerbic and pointed into his work, and it creates this kind of art that people are familiar with. But he takes aim at the representative body of the National Assembly, showing the legislative belly as a group of people who are simply like ogre-like and creatures who are fat, overweight, disaffected, and unconnected to any form of actual governing. So this gives you a sense of his notoriety here. Here is his famous piece Gargantua, and that is Louis Philippe. He's making fun of the monarch who basically eats all the bread of France that people are bringing him, leaving the rest of the country destitute. And what does he poop out of his chair? Nothing but proclamations and laws and orders that have to be fashioned, with the National Assembly conveniently located right at his behind. So gives you kind of a sense of what was thought of the king as an ineffectual monarch who really didn't have the people's best interest at heart. He was a ready target for insurrection. So Daumier's paintings carry over from his drawings. And what you're going to see is a lot of heavy emphasis on line art with not a lot of emphasis on color. These are the muted tones of the mid-century and the movement that we're about to jump into realism, where you don't, dress up the details. You let the gory details kind of come to the fore. And the grittiness and the challenge of dealing with contemporary issues and modern living seem to be best represented in that kind of artwork. But there are more Daumiers that I could show you. We have a couple of Daumiers in the DMA. Where they're occasionally up in the graphics wing of the museum. So you would be able to see even more content if you were able to go to the DMA. So however, the image that we have to know, I'll go back to that just to back things up a little bit. This is Daumier, the lampooner who is lampooning Nadar and his photography. So we'll come back and take another step, look at basically some moving pictures in just a second.